and I'm filling in for Sandra Bisarius, who is the director of the Center for Criminological Research and is out of town and on unstable internet. So I'm kind of filling in. And thanks for joining. This is our monthly speaker series for the CCR. And before we get going, I'll note that many of us are on the territory of the University of Alberta, and its buildings, labs, and research stations are primarily located in the territory of the Cree, Blackfoot, Stoney, Iroquois, Ojibwe, and Saulteaux lands that are now known as parts of Territory 6 and Treaty 6, 7, and 8, and homeland of the Métis. The University of Alberta respects the sovereignty, lands, histories, and languages and cultures of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And I will now ask Emily, who's going to introduce our speaker for today.
You can hear me all right? Sure. Okay. So today I'm very pleased to welcome Justin Piché. Dr. Piché is a full professor in the Department of Criminology at the University of Ottawa, where he also serves as the director of the Carceral Geography Collaboratory. He's also co-editor of the Journal for Prisoners on Prisons and is the author and co-author of several influential books, including How to Abolish Prisons, Lessons from the Movement Against Imprisonment. Since 2006, Dr. Piché has been deeply engaged in research, documenting, and advocating against prison construction in Canada, and his work bridges the scholarship and activism, including longstanding involvement with the Criminalization and Punishment Education Project, and the Coalition Against Proposed Prisons. So in today's talk, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Dr. Piché draws on nearly 2 decades of research and advocacy to examine how, even as incarceration rates in Canada have remained relatively stable, prison infrastructure continues to expand. And his work tells us a bit about the continuity and reform, as well as the long-standing or long-term social, financial, and community consequences of prison construction. So please join me again in welcoming Justin Piché.
All right. Thanks to Kevin and Emily for the introduction, and to Professor Bisarius for the invitation, and to the members of the CCR at the University of Alberta, especially Dr. Jeffrey Broussard and Leanne Stevens for organizing today's talk that I'm giving from where I sit here in Ottawa, which is located on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. And yeah, I guess you got to be careful what you put in an abstract, because sometimes you fall short of it, but we'll see what happens today. I am in the process of preparing this paper entitled "The More Things Change, the More They Stay the Same: Abolitionist Reflections on Shifts and Continuities in Canadian Imprisonment and Prison Infrastructure Development." I'm planning on submitting that later this year to Justice, Power, and Resistance for a special issue on prisons, detention, and resistance. So I appreciate the opportunity today's session offers to present a very small part of this work in progress at this early stage. So again, thank you. So before I dive into my presentation, I should mention that as a penal abolitionist scholar, I understand punitive injustice comprised of cops, courts, and cages as both a failed enterprise where meeting the goals set out by its proponents is concerned, and a success insofar as the penal system further entrenches oppressive structures that work to maintain inequality and injustice in society. So in understanding punitive injustice as both ineffective and harmful, my broader research program examines how imprisonment and, to a lesser extent, policing in Canada is reproduced and resisted in moments where the perpetual crisis of penalty is most visible and its future is unsettled, moments where possibilities exist for penal expansion or retrenchment. So jail infrastructure development is one of the phenomena I study now with the Carceral Geography Collaboratory at U Ottawa. And I do so with the goal of informing prison construction moratorium organizing presently with the Coalition Against Proposed Prisons and our NOPE, No Ontario Prison Expansion campaign, and drawing on Norwegian sociologist Thomas Mathiesen's notion of neutralization techniques in his book Prisons on Trial, that directs the scholar's attention to the approaches used by proponents of penalty to diffuse attempts to disrupt the status quo through critique, and to also diffuse attempts to introduce non-punitive approaches to social harm. My research in the context of prison construction moratorium organizing is to identify proponents of prison expansion and rigorously document the discourses and tactics they use to further their objectives and neutralize their opponents, along with also exploring the social forces animating these struggles that have the potential to shape carceral and decarceral landscapes for generations to come. And given that such research informs the discourses and tactics I use in concert with other organizers to stop planned prison infrastructure from being built, it's important that our analysis is on point, because if we get it wrong, the slim chances of succeeding in our efforts to stop new cages from being built become further diminished. So that's how I try and check myself. Am I seeing things honestly? Am I analyzing this in the proper way? Because if not, I'm not going to win, and I care about winning in this work. So where the present study is concerned, my objective is to examine the bureaucratic logic, site selection approaches, procurement and delivery models, and marketing discourses associated with initiatives to renew and increase human caging capacity from the mid-2000s to today, and what these tell us about shifts and continuities in the role of incarceration that plays behind and beyond bars in Canada. And to these ends, the larger paper explores three waves of prison capacity expansion in Canada, the first being the one that took place under the Harper punishment agenda that expanded the federal penitentiary system by 2,700 beds. A second one being a wave of provincial territorial jail construction projects that were meant to address a boom in the remand population. And then the current one that's unfolding today that really is about addressing the persistence of this remand situation, whereby people in provincial territorial prisons awaiting their day in court are still outnumbering those who are sentenced, and that number is growing. However, owing to time constraints, focusing on this current wave, one that in this country, one that Ojibwe elder Art Solomon reminds us is situated on stolen Indigenous lands that not long ago had no prisons. This work builds upon and updates the jail infrastructure projects included in a 2024 paper that was published in Criminologie in French that I co-authored with Olivia Gemma, who now works at EFRI Ottawa, as well as Mackenzie Plum and Liz Vexel, who are both my PhD students working under my supervision at U of O. So let me get into this, because there's a lot here, and I think we're going to have a good discussion afterwards. So over the past 5 years, jail capacity expansion has been taking place in a context where the number of imprisoned people awaiting their day in court continues to outnumber the number of imprisoned people serving sentences of 2 years minus a day in sites of confinement run by Canada's 10 provinces and 3 territories. Remanded prisoners outnumbering sentenced ones, as you know, at the provincial territorial level has been the case for 2 decades now. And now, over the past 5 years, there's been 9 provincial territorial jail infrastructure projects that have brought approximately 1,000 beds online at a cost of $541.4 million. I'll go into what's happening now, and this is a small list. I can email you these tables if you'd like. In addition to the ones that have been completed over the last 5 years, there's also 20 provincial territorial infrastructure projects comprised of at least 2,745 beds that are ongoing, with up to $3.8 billion earmarked for their construction thus far. And there's several projects you'll see there that have yet to announce how much they're actually going to cost. And in some cases, even the prisoner beds aren't determined yet. Much of my presentation today reviews each of these completed and ongoing jail expansion initiatives in turn to highlight the core justifications legitimating them. I do so, I want you to keep in mind 2 sets of penal sentiments that have been at work in recent years. So on the one hand, the early 2020s were marked by stated efforts to indigenize corrections in the wake of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. and the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls calls to justice to end the overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples behind bars. There were also, at the beginning of the 2020s, concerns with conditions of confinement and some support for alternatives to imprisonment during the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, where within the span of weeks, literally weeks, there was what Statistics Canada described as, and I quote, unprecedented declines in the adult custodial population, which amounted to roughly 7,000 or 19% fewer prisoners than the roughly 35,000 that were incarcerated prior to the pandemic. And then, so that's one set, there's kind of like this benevolent stuff going on. And on the other hand, the mid 2020s have been marked by a push for more jail, not bail, by Canadian politicians spanning the political spectrum in the wake of high profile acts of violence that are alleged to involve people who were out on bail, had previously been convicted of violent offenses, or both, such as the December 2022 killing of rookie Ontario Provincial Police Officer Greg Piché. So that's when you really started hearing these jail not bail calls really become popularized and mainstreamed. So I'm going to review these projects now. To the northeast, while Indigenous peoples faced arrest and political imprisonment for protesting the erection of a massive hydroelectric dam, I should say, in Labrador, that they warned would devastate the environment of nearby communities downstream, the government of Newfoundland and Labrador spent $10 million to add 36 beds to the Labrador Correctional Center so that criminalized women could be imprisoned, and I quote, closer to home. The decision occurred against the backdrop of an arrest of protesters, including Beatrice Hunter at the Muskrat Falls development by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who subsequently forcibly confined and displaced the women charged to Her Majesty's Penitentiary in St. John's, Newfoundland, where protests soon followed demanding their freedom. Justifying prison expansion as a means of imprisoning Indigenous people closer to home is what reconciliation looks like in Newfoundland and Labrador, where the province is also planning a new 395-bed prison for men and women that will replace Her Majesty's Penitentiary in St. John's. When this new facility was first announced in 2019, it was touted by the then Liberal provincial prison minister as a space for rehabilitation of inmates and a safer work environment for staff, while the newly elected progressive conservative government that signed nearly a $700 million public-private partnership to move forward with construction last year also emphasized how the facility will, and I quote, modernize corrections and improve public safety. Okay, so a need to increase the capacity to cage women and modernize imprisonment was also cited as a justification behind the construction of a new 39-bed unit for women on the grounds of the Provincial Correctional Center in Milton Vale, PEI. Acknowledging that, and I quote here, female offenders are typically different than male offenders often are, the island's Minister of Imprisonment claimed when the announcement was made that, and I quote, we're looking to come into the modern era and ensure that we're doing what we should be doing to ensure that our female offenders have good programming in place so that there are not a high risk of reoffending. Then PEI Status of Women Minister Natalie Jamieson stated that incarcerated women often have a history of trauma and many are themselves victims of crime, and the programs offered in custody must be responsive to their needs. So the new women's unit at the Provincial Correctional Center, which was made possible by $8 million from the federal government and $10 million from the provincial government for construction, opened in the fall of 2023, with government officials touting, and I quote, variety of programs, spaces to offer groups and individual women specific rehabilitative programs and interventions, education and literacy, life skills and job training and career development, along with new space to offer health care and rehabilitation to address the level of care currently needed. Okay, so Nova Scotia. All right, benevolent carceral expansion rhetoric can also be found in Nova Scotia, where the province is planning, and it's taking a long time to do this. It takes a long time to build prisons. is planning to replace the Cape Breton Correctional Center with a new prison. So, as put by the previous Liberal Minister of Imprisonment in that province when the project was first announced in 2018, when we look at correctional facilities, the geographical areas they represent, the objective desire is to keep inmates in close proximity to their own communities, and Cape Breton would be an area that requires attention. So the project, even though, we're like, calculate here, we're like almost 8 years later, it's still in the planning stages. It's in the process of being designed, and the president of the Nova Scotia Government of Employees Union has said that this site is going to be a brighter, cleaner place to do more innovative stuff with inmates and really focus on some rehabilitation as well. And anyways, still under design, slow moving. New Brunswick. When this project was first announced in 2021, then Progressive Conservative government of New Brunswick set aside $32 million for it, 100 beds, plus 9 segregation cells. And since that time, the project has run into significant turbulence, including revelations that the government of the day had not conducted a detailed assessment of their capacity needs prior to the announcement, and was also followed by opposition from residents in Fredericton that led to the original site being abandoned over, and I quote, fears that a jail could hurt the property values of nearby homes and that people no longer would feel safe with a jail located a few kilometers from where they and their children live. So the decision was to scratch the Fredericton plan, and they opened it up to an open siting competition where communities were asked, hey, do you want this jail in your community? And the rural community of Minto decided, hey, we want this thing, and they got it at the same time that the public safety minister was also the representative for their riding. But now the project's doubled to $66 million. Anyways, new Liberal government comes in November 2024. They conduct a facility review. There was rumors that they were going to pull it, but ultimately under pressure from the municipality of Minto and Grand Lakes, the premier noted that correctional institutions across the province are at capacity and overcrowding is causing safety concerns for everyone in those centers. We need to make sure people are safe. Here comes the new jail. All right, Quebec. In Quebec, where since the closure of the 2015 Maison Tanguay took place, most provincially imprisoned women have been held at Leclerc Institution. You may recall Leclerc Institution was a federal penitentiary from 1961 to 2013 when it was shut down by the Harper government. The province announced in 2022 that it would allocate $400 million to build a new 235-bed prison for women at the former Tanguay site. And it's done or being done in the name of providing an innovative model for managing correctional services for women, centered on the reality of women in the justice system, their profile, and their needs. The government added at the time that the new facility, and I quote, will be truly adapted to the reality of incarcerated women, and that will be able to offer them better prospects for social reintegration through better access to programs and services they need. All right. Quebec's government has also more recently earmarked $82 million to build prefabricated 96-bed units for men on the grounds of provincial jails in Sherbrooke, Trois-Rivières, and Quebec City in a stated effort to address crowding being caused by an increased use in remand. The province is also conducting a review of existing infrastructure at the Hall Detention Center with an eye towards retrofitting and expanding the site, being described as, and I quote, outdated and dysfunctional for several years, and we need to provide a healthy and safe infrastructure for the occupants, as well as meet the desired prison capacity required at the moment. Ontario. Ontario's, this is going to be a long one. So, in Ontario, the Ford government, since coming to office, has announced several jail infrastructure projects. The first ones they announced were to spend $96 million to expand the Kenora Jail and the Thunder Bay Correctional Center by 50 beds each. Those new units took roughly 2 years to build. They opened in 2022, and they were touted as providing improved access to programming, better living conditions, and support to demand the increased need for literacy, skills development, and technology training for safe community reintegration, while also improving the health and safety of new hires and providing a solution for overcrowding in both those existing facilities. They were also at the time when it opened touted for providing culturally appropriate programming and services for Indigenous individuals. That's how I'm reading their quotes here. A minister of Indigenous Affairs at the time said that the province's justice system needs to be responsive to the needs of Indigenous peoples and communities, and we can do this by offering greater opportunities for skills development, education, and literacy. These projects are basically a stopgap as the province embarks on building a new 345-bed Thunder Bay Correctional Complex, which is estimated to cost $1.2 billion over the life of a 30-year public-private partnership to design, build, finance, and maintain the carceral site. And like its contemporaries, it is said that this complex will, and I quote, address health, safety, and security issues for staff on the one hand, while on the other, enhancing access to programming, living conditions, and education for imprisoned people. And regarding the latter, it's noted that the project will create additional space for programming and expand supports for inmates with mental health issues. So, according to then Solicitor General Sylvia Jones, Ontario's penal system is in need of real change, leading edge interventions. They need to deal with decades of neglect, a changing and increasingly complex inmate profile, and increasing instances of inmate on staff violence. So basically, they're hoping that this project will address those things and provide programming for imprisoned people. Similar rhetoric existed in the initial promotion of the construction of new provincial spaces as part of the Eastern Region strategy, which includes the new construction and building upgrades to several existing facilities and the construction of new ones. So the strategy includes the 235-bed Eastern Ontario Correctional Complex, slated for construction on the grounds of the recently closed Kemptville Agricultural College, located on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, which may cost up to $499 million over the life of a 30-year jail mortgage. Also included in the strategy is a replacement of the Brockville Jail with what was originally announced as a 66-bed Brockville Correctional Complex for men and women, which has since ballooned to 250 beds, as well as 25-bed expansion of mental health beds for women at the St. Lawrence Valley Correctional and Treatment Center. So the local MPP, Steve Clark, was really happy about these initiatives in Brockville, which he used to be the mayor of, noting that it will provide treatment for imprisoned women with serious mental health needs. And he also notes that the project will expand on the expertise that he feels already exists at that facility. The Eastern Region strategy also includes the retrofit and reconstruction of the Quinte Detention Center with a new unit for women, which originally was 48 beds, but now it's 91 beds. They peg that cost of the retrofit of the facility and the addition of the women's unit to be $499 million. And again, when they announced this facility, they were touting inmate programming and recreational activities, and that these would be single occupancy cells that are coming online. You're going to see the rhetoric shift a bit now as we're talking about stuff that they've announced more recently. So the previously mentioned jail infrastructure projects announced in the late 2010s and early 2020s by the Government of Ontario were primarily touted as initiatives to modernize and expand jailing capacity in ways that would improve working conditions for staff on the one hand, while improving living conditions and rehabilitative offerings for imprisoned people on the other. Amid Ontario Premier Doug Ford's push for more jail, not bail, which included the creation of specialized police squads in the name of bail compliance and prosecution teams dedicated to bail hearings for the purposes of keeping more people behind bars pre-trial, along with reports of provincial jails being over capacity as we've increasingly relied on remand. Jail infrastructure initiatives announced more recently by the province maintain the stated commitment to modernization and equipping staff, while commitments to rehabilitation and improved conditions of confinement have waned. So when you review like the press releases, the media coverage, you'll see the word rehabilitation appear a lot less frequently in recent years, which may not be surprising given the kind of rhetoric around penalty that we're seeing now. So for instance, when the Ministry of the Solicitor General announced it would be retrofitting and reopening interment centers at the Elgin Middlesex Detention Center in London and the Toronto Interment Center to add 430 new beds, Solgen stated that the province is increasing capacity to keep violent and repeat offenders off our streets. And when the Interment Center in London reopened in March 2025, the Solicitor General repeated the aforementioned statement, while local MPP Rob Flack commented that, and I quote, "Our region voted for law and order, and our government is delivering. The added jail capacity and increased complement of correctional officers will strengthen public safety and the ability of law enforcement to deter and fight crime." Let's continue. So in July 2025, so this past summer, the province announced they would spend another $180 million to build 50-bed units at the Niagara Detention Center in Thorold, the Vanier Center for Women in Milton, and Sudbury's Cecil Facer Youth Center, which is being converted into a women's jail. In keeping with more recent announcements, the province noted that these projects will, and I quote, "give frontline staff the space they need to do their jobs safely." Solicitor General added, "Our government is taking decisive action to protect Ontario and keep dangerous and repeat offenders off our streets, and that the request for qualifications and standing offer procurement process, which essentially allows the province to order new prefabricated jail units off the shelf to be assembled on the grounds of existing sites of confinement, are going to bring, and I quote, "new beds online faster, strengthening our ability to hold criminals accountable and ensure that inmates serve their sentences in secure, modern spaces." So with two of the three jail infrastructure projects announced last July expanding the capacity to confine criminalized women, the press release concluded by noting the expanded facilities will offer enhanced rehabilitative programs, including literacy, job skills, and technology training. So it comes back in, not when the Niagara Detention Center, which mostly imprisons men, was mentioned, but it comes in relation to these two populations here. Let's continue. To the west, Manitobans elected the new Democratic Party to form provincial government in 2024. And in the name of addressing, and I quote, "violent crime and retail theft and the root causes of crime," the self-styled left-of-center NDP government announced, and I quote, "its Safer Neighborhoods, Safety Downtown, or Safety Downtowns, or Safer Downtowns public safety strategy that included establishing a new Center for Justice in Dauphin, a provincial jail that would offer culturally appropriate supports, education resources, and vocational training." The Justice Minister at the time of the announcement noted, "We believe in creating pathways to success rather than pipelines to prisons. By empowering and supporting our youth and preventing people leaving prison from reoffending, we're committed to ensuring our justice system provides support for those Manitobans who are ready to turn their lives around, find meaningful work, and give back to their communities." And while no details have been announced about the size, site, or procurement model for the new Center for Justice, the host community where the Dauphin Correctional Center was closed by the previous government in 2020 is welcoming the announcement, with Mayor David Boziak praising the creation of 50 to 100 well-paying jobs and the spin-offs of that, such as increased school enrollments and new housing construction. I think you're kind of getting the point here as to what I'm doing here in terms of the mix of some rehabilitative discourses and some explicitly repressive ones. So I'll skip a few jurisdictions. I did want to mention, since there are many of folks on the call today from Alberta, I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but I'm just putting it out there. There is at this stage, with very, very few details known, a correctional facilities planning initiative underway on the province's major projects map. So not sure what that means, but apparently there's going to be, just reading the slide here, location on the map is not exact. It's the legislature. I don't think they're building up a prison there to lock up the premier. But the project represents multiple locations. So stay tuned, I guess. Maybe you all know something I don't, but that's what I was able to find during this exercise. Skip this. Skip that. Some more prisons being built. All right. I could get into how much this is all costing and how much we could spend on supports upstream, but I think I want to get to where I think I'm going with all this avalanche of information about new jail infrastructure being built across the country at this time, and then trying to tie that into lessons learned from past prison expansion waves. So I'm not that far in my analysis at this stage, either where it concerns what these initiatives to renew and increasing human caging capacity over time tells us about shifts and continuities in the role incarceration plays in Canada, or the possibilities and pitfalls of abolitionist interventions. But I do have some preliminary thoughts. So at the level of processes, and here I'm referring specifically to site selection as well as procurement and delivery models for design, construction, and financing. I'll say that jailing authorities are becoming very much more efficient at erecting new cages. So today I discussed, or I tried to discuss as many as I could, 29 provincial territorial jail infrastructure projects. And all but 3 of them have or are in the process of being built on the grounds of existing jails. Okay, so that's roughly 90% of the time, 9 out of 10 times, when provinces and territories are looking to expand jail capacity, either with new builds or new units on existing sites, they're using the existing properties that they have. So what that means from, I guess, like an organizing perspective, if I can go there for a second, there isn't a pathway to challenge these projects through planning and permitting processes. So when they use this approach, which Seacrest called in 1992 pre-designation, where they use their existing property where imprisonment's already happening in communities, you can't really resist at that level. It's already there. They're just expanding on what they already got. These projects are increasingly being funded through public-private partnerships. I touched on that a bit. These allow governments to spread out the high cost of new jail infrastructure over time, and this opens up the possibilities for them to embark on more jail expansion initiatives if desired. And basically, they're just locking future governments into these expenditures and hamstringing them in terms of what they're doing, but they're also able to do more of what they want. Also, from a project delivery model, many of these projects now include prefabricated modular construction. So they're literally, for instance, the facilities in Thunder Bay, they by train and by boat brought prison units in and just stacked them on top of each other and whoop, put them together. This allows new jail spaces to be assembled faster. These still take a long time to plan, years, but the window to intervene and stop these things becomes a lot more shorter. Now, where justifications for more jail spaces are concerned, There's relative stability, I think, both outwardly in terms of like the benevolent and regressive sentiments legitimating punishment via the deprivation of liberty. But especially where you tend to see the more kind of progressive rationales for punishment is when these new sites are meant to incarcerate Indigenous people and women. Lastly, I'll say that I do think, although I wasn't able to get into it too much because I didn't explore the other two waves, resistance matters. And I would argue penal abolitionist organizing works as a moderating force contributing to penal stability in Canada. And I say this for a few reasons. I'll bring up a new example here. You may recall almost 20 years back, CSC's transformation, Correctional Service Canada's transformation. And at that time, that was happening under Stephen Harper in the name of law and order and getting tough on crime from 2006 to 2015. And during this period, that government had initially planned to build new regional complexes of 1,500 to 2,000 beds for federally sentenced prisoners serving sentences of 2 years plus a day. And they were each supposed to have like a reception unit, minimum, medium, maximum healthcare, mental health care, segregation, special handling units with centralized services and regional administration facilities. And so these were like US inspired mega prisons that were supposed to be erected in each of the federal penitentiary's 5 operational regions. Okay, so when Deloitte and Touche did an audit for this in 2007, they noted that each of those were supposed to cost $750 million through public-private partnerships to spread out the costs and the risk. The plan, however, hit a wall when concerns began to be raised about the projected doubling of CSC's budget in 2010, which you can read about in a paper I wrote in Social Justice called Playing the Treasury Card to contest prison expansion. But what followed amid news coverage and parliamentary interventions problematizing the cost of the Conservatives' punishment agenda was a less ambitious prison infrastructure strategy. So we went from these huge mega prisons in all the operational regions, and instead what the Conservatives did while under heat for not being fiscally conservative where punishment is concerned, they built 34 new units on existing penitentiary or on the grounds of existing penitentiaries, adding 2,500 beds at a cost of $601 million. So why am I raising that? And I could raise other examples as well, is that when there is some pushback, what tends to happen is less ambitious projects. So for instance, when I was involved in the No Ottawa Prison Expansion campaign, we stopped $1 billion jail from being built, 725 beds. What happened as a response to that after was the Eastern Region strategy a few years later announced by the Ford government, which is 235 beds in Kemptville. It was originally 66 in Brockville and 48 in Napanee. So like we shrunk the footprint. So I think when we think about the role that radical or even critical pushback can play, it can serve as a moderating force. And I have, we could debate this. When we think about, for instance, Scandinavian countries, say like Norway, would their penal system be what it is if, say, like Thomas Mathieson and the Chrome weren't pushing back in that country and trying to work towards the impossible, which is prison abolition, right? Does shifting the goalposts in that way help, without totally overinflating things, help create a moderating force where punishment is concerned? So I'm going to leave it there. I apologize again that I didn't actually get to deliver what I wrote in the abstract, but that's I don't know what I was thinking there in terms of being able to deliver that in the amount of time that I had. So we'll leave it there. I look forward to your questions, your comments, and even your insights to shape where the researcher is going. And there's so much there. So if anyone wants to do research or collaborate on stuff, I am open to it because there's no way you can cover any of this stuff, as I've just illustrated, well when it's this expansive. So thanks for that.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks, Justin. I appreciate that. That's a lot of info and a lot of developments. So I'm just going to open it up to kind of questions, comments from other folks. I know that I have at least one or two questions, but other people should start. And is that a hand from Sandra? Yeah, you're small on my screen. Yeah.
Yeah, can you guys hear me? Because I'm on my phone. Yeah, okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Justin. Super interesting. You just like in the end, you talked a lot about sort of like the influence that you can have and the footprint being smaller and all of these things. I was just wondering if you can speak a little bit more about that specifically, like how like with all the data that you've now collected, like are you in conversations with I don't know, ministries or stakeholders about this insane expansion program, and what do you think? Like, are you essentially are you meeting open ears? Are people listening to you who could have an influence?
No. So that's like the like as far as buy-in from government, I would say no, in part because what's happening as far as organizing against it is it is like explicitly out there, not trying to put pressure on governments internally, but rather trying to create political problems for them to then push things in a certain direction. And I would say, not that I don't think that work would be valuable to do. It's just sometimes you pick a lane and you live with the consequences of that, and sometimes it works. Like when we stopped the $1 billion jail, how that kind of ended up being derailed was the government was starting to plan public consultation sessions, and we would organize basically to disrupt them. And they realized that there was sufficient opposition across several sectors. We had people from education, mental health, healthcare, labor, all sorts of sectors coming out against it, and they backed away from it. And then new government took hold, and then decided that they were going to do this Eastern region strategy instead. So yeah, the approach that I've been involved in has been through community organizing, but that's not to say that perhaps at certain moments other approaches would be more effective. But yeah, I don't have, unfortunately, I don't have an ear with the government anymore in that way. So, but hopefully those that do can move things.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions, comments? Justin. Oh, the other Justin, sorry.
Thanks, Justin. Yeah, it's good to see you, and I appreciate you documenting all this and the costs and everything. It's really important work. I guess mine's like a theoretical question, and something I think a lot about in my work is I'm wondering how you define something like carceral expansion and the role of programming in carceral expansion. So I guess I don't know if you would use this phrase. I mean, pro-carceral expansion, anti-carceral expansion. Like, is there programming that does not result in prison expansion from like your perspective? So for example, you kind of like express skepticism of like job training program for uh, incarcerated people. And so I guess I'm wondering conceptually how you understand carceral expansion, and also where might prisoner rights kind of fit into this. So for example, like in my mind, prisoner rights are, obviously important and all that, but there's that kind of tension of, are you expanding the carceral system by providing more programming? I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, but I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think, well, because we're talking about the provincial territorial level, because most people are awaiting their day in court, there's not really a lot of programs on offer at that level, I guess, in comparison to the federal level to begin with. But yeah, I mean, if I'm understanding your question correctly, I think what I would say is when when there is strong community opposition, particularly coming from, if we could call this the left, you tend to see governments making more commitments towards providing rehabilitative programming or other kinds of programming that would perhaps be seen as useful by imprisoned people themselves. And so, like I think it's a contradictory and volatile process, to use Pat O'Malley's phrasing. And so there's a lot of tension in that, and a lot of prison expansion that does happen in this country happens in the name of rehabilitation, and um it happens in the name of improving conditions of confinement, addressing crowding. Now, does that mean that the programming itself is not useful or whatnot? That's not what I'm saying, but what I would say is that it is used as a discursive device to legitimate um more cages. Whether the folks on the ground would see like the actual um programs as useful or not is secondary, at least for me, in terms of what's actually happening, which means more people being deprived of their liberty. But yeah, I think in contesting prison expansion, in that way, you do force the state to, I think, treat people better. But I could be wrong.
Thanks a lot.
So I'll jump in. Thanks, Justin. I guess I'm going to pick up on your title. More things change and more things stay the same, or I think some version of that. I guess as someone who's paid attention to the abolitionist politics for more than 30 years at this point, you framed a lot of the discourse around building prisons, and it's almost all familiar. Fear of crime, rehabilitation, jobs, cost, etc. The only thing that seems different, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is the indigenous angle. From 30 years ago, that seems to me the only thing that's different. I just wondered if you want to sort of speak to that as a political discursive strategy and how this fits into your framework more. You move quickly over it, and I think it's the only thing that's new.
Yeah, I mean, if I could speak to so when new prison infrastructure comes online, like historically from, Kingston Penitentiary being built in 1835 before Confederation to those that are being built today, there's one thing that we could pick up on in relation to your question is that there's these characters, if you will, or actors that we point to as why we need to build new prisons to contain them. So, for instance, in 1938, I believe it was, the Archambault report was talking about, we need to introduce rehabilitation into prisons, and that doesn't really get taken up too much until the post-World War II period, where the Fauteur report repeated the same kinds of recommendations. And at that point, they had identified, there's the habitual, quote unquote, habitual offender and the incorrigible. And so we have to separate the two, and we need prisons that do these different things. And that's why we get, minimum and medium security federal penitentiaries coming online, and then the maximum ones that existed already from the Confederation period continuing on. And so there's these characters, the incorrigible, habitual offender, and the youthful one that we can change. Right now, the characters that we have, are kind of contained within this concept of the changing offender profile. So you start seeing this discourse come up in the mid 2000s, where it's posited that previous generations of imprisoned people were homogeneous. They were all the same in terms of their backgrounds and profiles. And now it is said imprisoned people today have more complex needs. There's more indigenous people behind bars. And to get to your question here, more Black people behind bars. They require culturally relevant programming. We need to build new prisons. More women behind bars. They require gender-specific programming, more prisons, more people living with mental health issues and drug use issues, specialized units within the prisons to deal with those things. And now involuntary care centers adjacent to the prisons that are coming online too, which I really didn't get into today either. But I guess, yeah, I think you're right to say that something that is different from the prison expansion projects, certainly in the 2000s compared to now, is more and more of a concern around meeting the needs of Indigenous peoples, and certainly that has to do with the calls to action, the TRC, and the calls to justice and the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, where you kind of have this tension where there's some recommendations that are talking about, we need more alternatives to incarceration. We need healing lodges run by Indigenous peoples. And then you have, for the folks that are going into the system, you need more culturally relevant programming. So there's this tension here, but I guess the point of it is that it keeps the reform train going, and we keep ending up with more and more prisons and not sufficient efforts to deal with what's been dubbed the overrepresentation or over incarceration. It's a tricky thing to engage with. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Are there other questions, comments, observations? Leanne, please. And Leanne and then L'Oreal.
Thanks for the talk, Justin. It was really interesting. And I especially found the rhetoric shifts you spoke about particularly insightful. And so it sounds like politicians and the media are basically justifying expansion based on public sentiment. So, for instance, going from catering to women's needs to reconciliation, and then this shift to like the jail, not bail, and public safety concerns. So, I'm just wondering if the public sentiment shifted towards abolition, do you think the provinces would slow down with expansion? And if so, do you see this as a realistic possibility, especially in a place like Alberta, where a lot of our population seems to be stuck on the tough on crime perspective?
I mean, realistically, I think, and I'm thinking more through this idea of penal abolition as being a moderating force, because even say in the early 2020s, like with I didn't really get into it too much, but with the global uprisings that followed the death of George Floyd in Minnesota and the mainstreaming of calls to defund the police and stuff like that, concerns around Indigenous reconciliation, concerns around ending anti-Black racism. If you look at like the projects that the prisons that were being announced at that point, even as prison populations declined during the first wave of COVID, and they were still announcing new prisons like Ford did with Kempville, you had those projects still going forward, but they tended to be smaller, and they tended to try and really focus on rehabilitation. So I think like radical discourses or critiques tend to maybe slow it down and make things smaller, but I don't know. I'm trying to be hopeful for from where I stand. um I'm not sure the popularization or mainstreaming of prison abolition would necessarily result in like massive reductions in imprisonment or stop prison construction altogether, until such time that there was a fundamental restructuring of society. And I'd say most abolitionists, reading the work of Angela Davis or like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, would say like when we're talking about prison abolition, like really what we're talking about is a fundamental restructuring of the way we live and relate to each other. And I think we're seeing right now lots of folks have talked about like the end of the liberal capitalist system as we know it seems to be coming to an end, and what's about to come in its place is in the air, and that's going to be decided through struggle, right? Whether we end up with fascism or we end up with something else that would be perhaps more life-giving and more exciting for all of us. So organizing matters, but I think without a broader restructuring of society, the situation in which we currently find ourselves in, I would say abolitionist interventions are about moderating things until such time that radical possibilities emerge. But yeah, I don't know if that's a fair
That
answer.
I feel like that does answer my question.
Okay.
Thank you.
L'Oreal, we have one from L'Oreal, and we also have a question. Who's that from? From Sarah Turnbull in the chat. So L'Oreal.
Hi, Justin. Thank you so much for your talk. I echo what others have said about it being really important to kind of track these changes. And it was quite interesting to see the differences by provinces as well. So I think it's really important work you're doing. And I do have kind of two questions. I might ask them both. You don't have to answer them both. I know we're running out of time. But the first question, I think it maybe builds off of what the other Justin was asking. And so in your presentation, you kind of focus on like the quantity of expansion, right? Like all these different prisons, but I guess I'm wondering more about what you see as like the quality of the expansion, or how different proposed prisons might differ in some way. So for example, building something like a new Edmonton Remand Center is going to be very different than building a Healing Lodge, or something along those lines, right? So I'm wondering if your data speaks to that at all, or if that's something you're thinking about. And then my second question maybe is more methodological. You used the term abolition as a moderating force, which I think is quite interesting. But I'm wondering, as like a criminologist or sociologist or as a researcher, how you assess that, like how you would go about figuring that out, like what the moderating force of abolition work would be, or maybe how you define the success of that, I guess.
Okay, so yeah, for your first question, in terms of thinking about like what's actually coming in line in terms of these spaces and what they're doing. If you one source that I'm turning to now to try and understand how infrastructure is changing is reading up literature and things that architects themselves are putting out there. And one concept that's in the literature, and this is being picked up by some carceral geographers as well, is the concept of normalization. So this idea that they're building prisons, and with an understanding that they're trying to make them as proximate to normal life as possible. And so they'll have spaces within prisons that are as close to the outside world for folks who follow the rules, complete their programs, and so on. And for those who don't do that, they go to what would be considered like the traditional jail spaces, the ranges and stuff like that. So I would see that as going on in terms of the quality of what is being built, aside from what I focused on or often focus on, which is the quantity. As for the second question, like how do you know whether or not say abolitionist interventions are impacting things, or if there's other forces that are moderating things as well? Certainly there is, and I don't want to overinflate the role that abolitionist organizing plays in this phenomenon that we're talking about. But I think one of the things that I do in my research is it's action research. I really didn't get into that at all, but basically the first step for me in understanding it's an iterative process is to first understand what the penal field looks like, which is much of what was the focus of today's presentation. And then after that, through understanding like the discourses that are at work, the processes that they're using to advance prison construction, to then try and craft discourses and tactics to try and counter those, and then see how the state or how prison authorities and governments respond to those, document those, and then that spurs further action in response. So it's kind of like this ongoing research to inform the action on the ground, and the action, assess that, and then research, and then inform action again. So I don't know if that explains things, but I think through trying to turn a critical lens on yourself and the organizing that you're doing, and whether or not the understandings that you had going into that were actually accurate. So could say, for instance, that in the case of the whole CSE's transformation stuff, I did do that and did see discourses change, say in the media, or how the government was talking about prison expansion at the time, and then materially what it actually did, moving from regional complexes to a much less ambitious, smaller construction program. Same goes with the first NOPE campaign, No Ottawa Prison Expansion, was about, okay, what rhetoric are they using? What processes are they using to advance this? And how can we intervene in the moment of public consultation to send this thing off the rails? And we did. And something less ambitious came up later on. But under the context of jail, not bail, all these projects are now getting bigger, right? So Brockville Correctional Complex being one of them was 66 beds. Now it's 250. So, and now we study that and try and understand how we can intervene again. Is that helpful in terms of an answer?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for explaining that.
So I think we're coming up on time here, but Sarah, Professor Turnbull did ask a question. I think maybe you could just quickly address. So I'll just summarize the end a bit here. Have you encountered any discourse around disaster proofing or future proofing prisons for public health crises, climate change, related issues like forest fires or droughts?
Yeah, so for climate change, and this is maybe to also circle back to Kevin's question, to your question, Kevin, earlier about like what's changed here.
Right.
Green prisons, that's something that has changed in the last number of decades, where and I have a paper in Contemporary Justice Review in 2017 that talks about that with Shanice Kluskens and Kevin Walby. But yeah, there was the emergence of this discourse like we're going to build these new prisons and they're going to be green, they're going to use sustainable construction materials, they're going to consume less energy, so on and so forth. So there is some of that there. I would say since there's been some skepticism around climate catastrophe, that at least like politically and like, by carbon tax has gone away, other kinds of environmental initiatives have waned, that you don't find that as much in more recent press releases. So it's like whatever is in vogue or popular at the time or in people's minds at the time, you will see those mentioned in prison expansion marketing. COVID-19, I recall, but I'm gonna have to go check my notes. I think in one prison expansion announcement, and I'd have to, I can't remember which one, there was a mention that like we need to build this new prison to basically prevent the transmission of airborne diseases, but that has not been a significant discourse that is present in current projects. I recall only seeing it once. And as for disaster proofing, I guess we'll find out. But they often put these sites in on lands that are that are like the existing sites, and they're often on lands that were deemed unusable for other kinds of production. So yeah, will we see more prisons being presented as ways to provide better air quality and temperature control to imprison people? You know, further away from flood zones. I don't know, but it's certainly something to pay attention to in the coming years as our environment gets further and further degraded. That's hopeful. Anyways, I hope that answered your question.
And there's a note to end on.
Ooh.
Anyway, please join me in thanking Justin for his talk. And just a reminder that our next monthly, like a bit more than a month, speaker series will be March 6th, and it'll be Professor Jim Shepticki. I think he's going to be talking about a book that he has forthcoming, tentatively called, or maybe already called, The Reluctant Criminologist. So it's a good title, and we'll see what he has to say then. So thanks again, Justin. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. And again, if anyone has questions or wants access to the tables or has critiques that you've withheld from providing today, feel free to send them my way. I'm happy to engage with that and consider it as I wrap my head further around all these prisons that are being built at the moment. So thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Justin. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
To you. All right.